Hello and welcome to this UGC lecture series on climate change. And today we will be talking about abridging traditional wisdom and modern science to combat climate change. Global climate change, as debated in the recent Copenhagen summit, is the most severe environmental challenge that has so many dimensions: political, ecological, environmental and economic, and it steers humanity with a number of catastrophes, including threat to biodiversity, environmental security, and agriculture and energy production. Despite much scientific evidence substantiating climate change and much research in this area of ecology and environmental sciences, considerable uncertainty still exists about the rate and extent of climate change in different regions of the world in general and Kashmir Himalayan region in particular. In fact, this global climate change is a global phenomenon which of course needs local action. And in this regard, the questions how the global climate change will affect indigenous people and regional ecosystem processes, and can an expanded scope of knowledge and inquiry augment our understanding and mitigation of climate change merit urgent consideration, especially in the context of Kashmir Himalaya. Of course, there is much more than meets the eye in the global climate change debate, and the problem and motives at times seem more political and economic in nature than environmental and scientific. This was even very clear from the recent Copenhagen summit, where despite many debates, discussions, and hectic schedule, no meaningful negotiations could be achieved. Despite the growing evidence substantiating global climate change, there is a big group of people who oppose the very idea of this climate change. However, the award of Nobel Peace Prize 2007 to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's IPCC and Mr. Al Gore, the former Vice President of United States of America, signals the gravity of the problem and also the urgent attention that it calls for. According to the fourth assessment report of IPCC, released in 2007, the Earth's climate has been changing unequivocally, and this climate change has been discernible in terms of increasing temperatures, rising sea level, melting glaciers, and changing ecological settings. Why to worry about this climate change? The impacts are so horrible of climate change that we have necessarily to be worried, particularly because the impacts are cumulative, they are irreversible, and what we emit here is going to have an impact elsewhere, and what we emit today is going to have an impact tomorrow or sometime ahead in the future. And the context of the climate change is global, of course needing the local actions. One more important thing that makes us worry about the climate change is that the countries or the regions which are most highly impacted are least equipped to combat it on one hand, and on the other hand, they share the most important natural resources such as forests and water bodies that act as the sinks for greenhouse gases, and as such deserve the price for that. Since much has been talked and written about climate change, how this global climate change is caused, what exactly it is, how the future global climate is going to look like, and how it is going to impact people in different regions across the globe. However, the present talk will specifically explore the possibilities of combating climate change using the traditional ecological knowledge and modern scientific approaches in unison, especially in the context of Kashmir Himalaya. But let's first define climate and climate change. Climate is average weather, especially temperature and precipitation of an area over a long period of time, usually more than a month. And climate change is defined as variation in the climate or mean variability in the climate state over an extended period of time, usually decades or longer. And it encompasses changes in the sea level, the rise in the sea level, changes in the precipitation pattern, uneven changes in the biodiversity profile, and extreme weather events, etc. Climate change is caused by both natural and anthropogenic factors. The most important factors that determine the climate change include changes in the sunspot cycle, changes in the Earth's orbit, changes in clouds, changes in the ice sheets, volcanic eruptions, changes in the atmospheric gases, particularly the greenhouse gases, and internal wiggles, especially the El Ninos and the La Ninos. Besides these natural background changes, humans have been influencing enhancing the climate change principally by increasing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Climate change affects people irrespective of their region, origin, or religion. The most important consequences of climate change include increase in the intensity of hurricanes, frequent droughts in some places, and increase in the intense rainfall in some other places. It also changes the functioning of the natural ecosystems such as forests, wetlands, and lakes, etc. It also leads to increased pest outbreaks and causes uneven changes in agriculture with facilitative role for some crops in some regions and negative role for some crops in other regions. And according to IPCC projections in 2007, probable temperature rise between 1.8 degrees Celsius and 4 degrees Celsius, and possible temperature rise between 1.1 and 6.4 degrees Celsius is expected, which will trigger sea level rise by 28 to 43 centimeters and will lead to disappearance of Arctic summer sea ice in second half of the century. There are many scientific ways for adaptation and combating climate change, which mainly include: number one, geo-engineering approaches, wherein accelerating the adaptation of natural biosystems through species transplantation and afforestation is recommended. Second, establishing and maintaining gene banks to preserve biodiversity, reducing emissions. Then strengthening the physical infrastructure, which includes hardening seacoast structures against sea level rise, including sea walls. Second, assuring resilience of transportation, communication, and transmission infrastructure. Then construction of climate conditioning building structures. Then another important point is strengthening the information infrastructure, which includes improving environmental monitoring, including detection of early warning signals, improving climate prediction and weather forecasting, improving early warning system for floods and other natural disasters. Strengthening institutional infrastructure is another approach, which includes developing agricultural systems and practices better suited to climate variability and change. Land use planning, for example, limiting development in low-lying coastal areas, wetlands, lakes, or floodplain areas, and other actions to limit precarious land uses. The next important issue is developing a balanced energy system or strategy, which includes transition to clean energy options, especially using the emerging technologies, and also strengthening the energy security system. These scientific options of adapting to and mitigating climate change would be successful only if countries at a global level are able to set the mitigation targets, which of course is not that easy, as we have recently witnessed in the Copenhagen summit, where countries were very much reluctant to have legal bindings on the emission cuts. And second important thing is those regions which have natural resources such as forests and water bodies that act as sinks for the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, they deserve compensation. And this carbon trading, including carbon debt and carbon credit system, needs to be legalized and globalized in an institutional way. Then we also need to have a proper public policy and regulation and research and development pattern in this global climate change area. If we are really very serious to combat and mitigate climate change and reverse its impacts, then we have to think differently, and we have to act, in fact, locally while thinking globally and acting together. In fact, United Nations Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC, has identified local knowledge as an important missing element in its previous assessments and a focus of its work for its next assessment processes. So we have to first of all understand what we mean by traditional ecological knowledge. Traditional ecological knowledge is a cumulative body of knowledge, practice and belief based on observations and experience and passed on through generations by cultural transmission about the relationship of living beings with one another and their environment. This indigenous knowledge is the basis for local level decision making in many rural communities. It has value not only for the culture in which it is evolved, but also for scientists and planners striving to improve conditions in the rural communities. Incorporating indigenous knowledge in climate change policies is going to make combating climate change process more cost effective, participatory and sustainable in nature. Why these indigenous people matter in combating climate change? The reasons are more than one. Because they are the custodians of natural resources critical for carbon sequestration. They are repositories of traditional knowledge on climate change and its adaptations. They also have a proven capacity to adapt to climate change. So, indigenous people's traditional knowledge on climate change can substantially enrich our knowledge of combating climate change. Let's first of all understand in the context of Kashmir Himalaya what our value-based traditional systems have been that we can explore for combating the climate change. A sizable proportion of Kashmir Himalayan population lives in mountains and is represented by the indigenous communities, which live in close proximity with nature, in close harmony with their environment. Of course, having different historical backgrounds, different mother dialects, different cultural practices, religious beliefs, and folk traditions. Especially Kashmiri Sufis and saints have been very much eco-conscious, and they have recommended a simple lifestyle which should be in complete harmony with nature and the environment. And in addition, many people also believe that the spirits and the souls of their ancestors live in sacred lakes, sacred plants, sacred groves, sacred mountains even, which they worship and revere for their value-based traditions. And this indirectly influences and in fact helps in combating climate change, because these lakes, water bodies, trees, forests, groves, mountains are an important system of or important part of the climate change system. Therefore, when due to the impact of climate change, this biodiversity erodes or these sacred trees vanish or these mountainous systems are influenced, these indigenous communities perceive that their identities are at stake and they are eroding. In Kashmir Himalaya, there are many local indicators of climate change. We have been witnessing over the years shift in the rainfall pattern, not only in the amount of the rainfall, but in the timing of the rainfall, and also in the timing and amount of the snowfall, which has been going down as compared previously. Then also there has been a shift in the distribution of this rainfall. Moreover, this climate change is discernible by the changing phenologies of certain plant species. Those plant species that would normally flower in, say, April or May are now flowering with the onset of March only. And another important local indicator of climate change in the Himalayan context is the fast receding of glaciers. Ice and glaciers cover more than 70% of the Greater Himalayas. The greatest area covered by these glaciers and permafrost after the polar regions. And the rapid rate of their receding is alarming. In fact, in view of these very clear indicators of climate change, we have to act locally and act very fast. And instead of only opting for scientific approach, we will also have to take into account our local traditions and cultural value-based practices to combat this climate change. And there are many ways to integrate indigenous knowledge for mitigation and adaptation to climate change, for which we have to realize, first of all, the indigenous knowledge as an alternative with the capability of dealing with past and present vulnerabilities to climate extremes. And also we have to acknowledge the bottom-up approach of combating climate change that's participatory in nature based on the community level participation. There are 5 areas in which traditional ecological knowledge can help us in complementing the modern scientific approaches for combating climate change. Number 1, to use this traditional knowledge as a local skill expertise. Number 2, to use this traditional knowledge as a source of climate history and baseline data. And number 3, to use this traditional knowledge in formulating research and hypotheses to address the climate change problem. And also number 4, to use this climate change as an insight into impacts and adaptations in Himalayan indigenous communities. And last not but least, very important point is to use this traditional knowledge for long-term community-based monitoring. And these 5 areas of convergence have a tremendous potential if linked to modern scientific practices to combat climate change regionally in the context of Kashmir Himalaya. What we need to do this is that we have to set a debate on the issue of climate change regionally across the table. We have to apprise the common masses about the local indicators of the climate change, and we have to collect data and have a database very rich based on our traditional value-based systems. And third important thing is that we have to develop a unified conceptual framework wherein these traditional areas can fit best into the modern scientific models and practices to combat climate change. And most important is that we have to convince academia and policymakers, also the NGOs, about the problem of the climate change and the coordinated efforts that we need to combat it. Doing so in Kashmir Himalayan context will help us answering some unanswered questions which are very important. Number 1, how do indigenous people in Kashmir Himalayan region perceive this climate change? And second, how a multidimensional approach, including traditional ecological knowledge system and modern scientific practices in unison, can help us better combating climate change. And third, how a common conceptual framework can be given to the common masses for understanding the impacts of climate change and also overcoming with the possible solutions based on their experiences and also based on the modern scientific alternatives. However, we will be able to answer these questions only if we are able to overcome certain challenges. And there are some key challenges in this way. Number 1, recognizing the high vulnerability of indigenous people to climate change. Number 2, involving indigenous people as key partners in climate change adaptation mechanisms. And number 3, integrating indigenous knowledge on climate change program designs and implementation. 4th, designing climate change adaptation programs that do not undermine customary rights to land and natural resources of these indigenous communities. And very important point that we in no case can underestimate is that we have to ensure that these climate change adaptation possibilities or alternatives in no way further undermine the vulnerability of the indigenous communities while combating the climate change. If we live in harmony with nature, we preserve our natural resources such as forests, wetlands, lakes, and other water bodies, the climate of this region would automatically be taken care of until and unless we are not impacted by the changes that are taking place elsewhere, for which we have to have a national mechanism to see to this that emissions outside the country do not impact our pristine Kashmir Himalayan region. We will be talking about this topic in our next lecture. Till then, goodbye.